So welcome all. Most of you know that I'm Roger Berkowitz, director of the Hannah Arendt Center here at Bard College, and very happy today to welcome here two people to talk about Hannah Arendt's poetry. Hannah Arendt, as many of you know, was widely said, or often said, that she knew the entire canon of German poetry by heart. And to read Hannah Arendt in English is often to forget that. One of the real interesting things is to read both her book, The Human Condition, which she wrote in English, and her book, Vita Activa, which she wrote also in German, and didn't just translate, but rewrote. And the references to German poetry, sometimes spoken or said to be references, and sometimes just you have to hear them, are enormous. And one really sees how she thinks through poetry. And one of the fascinating, I think much of the work to be done on Hannah Arendt still is to look at the poetic input and background of much of her thought. Some of that work is starting to be done since the Denktagebuch has come out, in which she's often discussing poems, both hers and others. But in addition to her obvious interest in and deep knowledge of German poetry, and also American poetry, one should say, English poetry, she wrote poems. A total of, we found about, 50-something?
74.
73 or 4.
It's 73.
We have
73. It's absolutely. I wrote 73.
73 poems that are scattered in letters, Nachlass, the Denktagebuch, and elsewhere. And a number of them, but not all of them, were published in the back of Mary McCarthy's biography of Hannah Arendt, For the Love of the World.
Elizabeth Young Bruns.
What did I say?
Mary McCarthy.
And I thought, really?
Don't worry, everybody.
Pardon.
We're
Elizabeth
in
Young
her
Bruns,
heart.
really wonderful autobiography. I'm going on very little sleep here, so I apologize. No, Elizabeth Young Bruns' autobiography of Hannah Arendt, I'm just not thinking, For the Love of the World. And since then, the Denktagebuch has collected more. And we have here two people who are both friends of the Arendt Center. Samantha Rose Hill is actually Arendt Center postdoctoral fellow this year. And Karin Biro has been a member of the center and attended our conferences for at least 3 or 4 years now.
Yes.
They both independently, I don't think they knew about it until I let them both know, we're both working on editions of Hannah Arendt's poetry, one in French and German, and one in German and English. Given that they are both doing that, and that Samantha was here as a fellow this year, and Karin was thinking of coming to the States anyway, this became an obvious and fortuitous meeting of the poetic minds. So they picked a wonderful title, No Word Breaks into the Dark, a quote from Arendt's about the power of poetry. I'm very excited to have them here. I mean, Karin is someone who teaches at Sciences Po in France. She's written a number of books. Her latest on Hannah Arendt. The German, it's happy is the one who has no Heimat.
It's in here, it's on the handout.
Happy is the one who has no country or no home. It's from one of Hannah Arendt's poems that she will be talking about. It is a collection of the poems written in both German and then translated into French. And there's an essay by Karin at the back, in the front.
Introduction in the front and essay at the end.
An essay in the back. So it just came out, hot off the presses.
Today.
Today
is the publication
Today
day. So this is a very exciting moment. I mean, I not for Karin as well, but for us, to have the poems for the first time published in one really beautiful edition. and we're waiting for Sam's as well that will treat it to us with English translations. In any case, Sam is a postdoctoral fellow here. She did her doctoral dissertation at the University of Massachusetts on the promise of mourning, and she is working also on a bilingual edition of Hannah Arendt's poems. Karin is going to speak first,
Yes.
about 15 minutes.
Yeah, about 15 minutes. I think
And then
Try to keep it.
Samantha is going to speak for another 10 or 15 minutes.
15.
I hope
I'll go quickly.
we'll have a little time for discussion and questions at the end, and I'm very much looking forward to this. So please welcome Karin Biro.
Okay.
There was a handout with some of the poems on it. I hope
Yeah.
It was passed
it was passed around.
And it's in number 10, the last verse is the title, the French translation of the book, number 10. Well, I'm very happy to be here today and to meet you. I will tell you, I will first give you some information about how I discovered Hannah Arendt poems. Can be interesting, and then I will make a short presentation of what is in there, because the book exists now. First, I have to apologize for my quite poor English, so please, I would have preferred to talk or in French or in German. German is my mother tongue, French is my adopted mother tongue, if ever this exists. But there are a lot of people who I think speak more than one language, and so they know what I'm talking about.
Votre anglais c'est mieux que notre français.
I didn't finish talking yet. Be careful. So, how I discovered Hannah Arendt's poems. It was, it goes a little bit back, so I have to. It was in 2006, the year of the 100th anniversary of Hannah Arendt's birth, when a substantial number of new publications appeared, highlighting her intellectual contribution to the understanding of our times. It was now possible to discover and rediscover her world of thinking as it appears in the Denktagebuch, her laboratory of thinking, first published by Pieper in Munich, or in Arendt's different exchanges of correspondence with Martin Heidegger, her professor and lover, with Jaspers, her Doktorvater, with Heinrich Blücher, her husband, with the writer Hermann Broch, with the Zionist tutor Kurt Blumenfeld, and with Mary McCarthy, her closest female friend. This year, where a lot of correspondence was published on her. Many of these books revealed not only Hannah Arendt's relevance to contemporary political thought, but also more personal aspects of her life, her deep understanding of friendship, and her concern for the public sphere, wherever she happened to be. This resurgence, even on an international level, offered a rather large public the opportunity to discover a Hannah Arendt who was as yet not very widely known. Margarete von Trotter's movie, some years later, underlined this new interest. I know the importance of Bart for the movie. As a matter of fact, it was precisely Hannah Arendt's, German term, Intellektualität, her feelings, her public personality, and her private person that caught my attention and made me want to go further into her world. I prepared a semester for my students at the Institute of Political Science in Paris after choosing to study Hannah Arendt by reading large passages from this correspondence. I hope that Hannah Arendt's contacts with her friends, her peers, the philosophers of her time, writers and poets she read and was in touch with, would reveal her personality and permit us to enter her mental universe, her Denkraum, as well as the world of her emotions, passions, and thought. this was a part which should bring to my students another aspect of Hannah Arendt than the usual one. They knew already, because they had a lot of courses in French concerning Hannah Arendt's political thought. So as I am German by origin, it was important for me to take another axe, another point of view, to bring Hannah Arendt to them. Then came the definite click. Listening once more to the interview she gave in '64 to the German, it's on YouTube, to the German journalist and later politician Günter Gauss, I heard her say, Dichtung hat in meinem Leben immer eine große Rolle gespielt. And
Poetry in my
Oh,
life
yeah.
has always played
Yeah,
a large role.
A large, yeah. I think everybody understood this, but I want to read the second one, which is a little bit more complex, and then I will give you the English translation. But I grabbed the opportunity to speak, to introduce a little bit of German.
Which one is this?
This
This
one.
is separate.
This is
Oh.
separate now. It's another quotation of hers concerning poetry. There was the first one and now is the second one. And this one is, die gewissermaßen menschlichste und unweltlichste der Künste ist die Dichtkunst, deren Material die Sprache selbst ist und deren Produkt dem Denken, das es inspirierte, am nächsten bleibt. That's what she wrote in Vita Activa and in The Human Condition, both. And the English translation is not for me, I took it over. Poetry, whose material is language, is perhaps the most human and least worldly of the arts, the one in which the end product remains closest to the thought that inspired it. And later again in her essay on Bertolt Brecht, I found this quotation, poetry, beauty, romance, love, these are what we stay alive for. You see the different theoretical thought on poetry, her own the poetry in her signification for herself, and poetry when she talks of other poets. These statements and many others I found led me to focus definitely on the poems that Arendt herself had written. I wanted to know where this particular interest of hers came from. How many poems had she written? And what part had they played as she forged the corpus of her writings? I started collecting poems, about 20 of them in Elizabeth Young Brude's biography, Hannah Arendt for Love of the World. They concern what I call her first poetic period, from 1923 to 1928. Then I located almost 30 other poems in the Denktagebuch, covering the years from 1950 to 1961, to her friends, to Martin Heidegger, after her first trip back to Europe after war, after 1950. They got me to wondering what had happened in the years from 41 to 50, in this period. I knew I had to find an answer to this question, and this, no doubt, would mean consulting the Hannah Arendt archives. Thanks to some background information I had obtained earlier from Brude's biography, I knew that ever since her childhood, Arendt had shown a profound interest in and enthusiasm for poetry. She had learned poems by heart, had declaimed them wherever she could, and had written down for herself the ones she liked the most. Thanks to several German Hannah Arendt experts, I knew about her use of quoted verses of Hölderlin, Goethe, Rilke, Nietzsche, Trakl, etc., etc. I was also familiar with Men in Dark Times, in which Arendt portrays contemporary poets she met, had discussions with, and exchanges about poetry, such as Walter Benjamin, Bertolt Brecht, Hermann Broch, W.H. Auden, Randall Jarrell, etc., etc. So, what pushed me to go further? I wanted to understand her poems deeper than just by catching a superficial emotion. That couldn't be that. I wanted to understand her forms, where did they come from, and the influences she might have had. I found it easy to distinguish the different periods of her creation by following her biography. I told you already, from 23 to 27, from 41 to 50, and 51 to 61. But why did she stop then? Why did her poetry suddenly come to an end in 61, 62? How to explain, and this bothered me particularly and evoked my curiosity, how to explain the apparent paradox between her philosophical strengths, her historical studies, her theoretical impetus and analytic mind on the one hand, and on the other, in secret, without telling anybody anything about that, her poems in verse and more seldom in prose. On the one hand, articles, essays, lectures, books devoted to complex and dense subjects like totalitarianism, the Eichmann trial, Rosa Luxemburg and Revolution, and Judgment, and so on. And on the other, poems that take their inspiration in form and metaphor from the storehouse of German Romantic writings and from classical literature. You know, wherever people ask me the question, what are you working on right now? I said, I'm working on Hannah Arendt's poems. A big silence. So, did she write poems?
Always the first thing people say.
Exactly. And that means that there were somewhere a cut off of a part of her writings, just cut off, whatever the reasons were. I wish to establish whether there was a kind of evolution in her poems, whether they lead indirectly or directly to her political theories or philosophical subjects. All these questions engaged me increasingly in a quite ambitious enterprise and led me finally consult the Hannah Arendt archives in New York. To be honest, thousands of doubts assailed me. When I began my research seriously 3 years ago, you are right, 3 years ago, I wasn't at all sure that I would be able to deal with the complexity of all the issues confronting me. My academic formation is primarily literary. I am not a philosopher. So I read the things differently, from different point of view. I studied German and French literature and civilization. My knowledge of philosophy was quite superficial and remained for a long time connected to literary periods and very general considerations. But I was lucky in the fact that Hannah Arendt's poems, let's say, my first rendezvous with them, the echo they provoked in me had made such a strong impression on me that in spite of all my doubts, I forged ahead with my project. In 2013, family reasons called me to New York for a whole month. I was aware that Hannah Arendt's archives were digitalized at the New School of Social Science. Out of the blue, I wrote to Roger Berkowitz and Jérôme Cohn. I informed them about my plans and asked them what they thought of it, and I hoped they would give me some helpful advice. Right away, Roger suggested a meeting in New York, and Jerome Cohn arranged to get me permission to consult the archives at the New School Library. Being here today, in the prestigious house of Mary McCarthy and Hannah Arendt Center now, talking to you about Hannah Arendt's poetry and my book, Heureux celui qui n'a pas de patrie. Hannah Arendt makes this, no, I take back the phrase, being here today, etc., and talking to you about my book makes me feel I have returned to the very beginning of my project. Anyway, I'm happy to have this opportunity to thank you personally, you, Roger, for your encouragement and your help. Thanks to you, I saw my project to its conclusion after finding an experienced French translator, because I didn't translate them. I'm not, French is my adopted mother tongue, but not by my mother tongue in the way to make a literary poetic translation. So, thanks, yes, thanks to you, I saw my, and I found the French translator, François Mathieu, who agreed to join me in this complex, sometimes difficult and daunting enterprise. He didn't translate, he transposed the poems from German into French. And you know what he says? He says he writes a poem on the poem. That's what he does. He writes a poem on the poem. He doesn't translate. It doesn't even make a real transposition, but he writes a poem on the poem. That is his way of working. That's what he did here. So he transposed the poems, and I verified the accuracy, the German accuracy and authenticity of his translations. I wrote an introduction and a study to accompany the first presentation of all of Hannah Arendt's poems, or at least all of those I was able to locate. This has been the most wonderful creative experience I have lived so far. There followed a more down-to-earth task. We had to find a publisher. You know what I mean? Yeah. Finally, the well-known French publisher, Payot. But I have to tell you, I wrote to about 15 French well-known publishers who published a lot of titles of Hannah Arendt. There was only one who really got profoundly interested. And that's because behind Hannah Arendt there's another shape, something completely different. And that's why I understood this later. I was just set up by the fact, you know, first, to not get any reply. And so, finally, the well-known French publisher, Payot, who had already published some of Hannah Arendt's works, as well as various titles devoted to her writings, welcomed our project. It took almost another 2 years to clear up all the complicated copyright issues. It would be in a book. Yeah. And to solve other unforeseen difficulties. Finally, the necessary permissions came through. In a way, the prospect of discussing some of the poems with Samantha Hill, the translator of Hannah Arendt's poems into English, is like a second birth for me. You know what that means. For this volume of Hannah Arendt's collected poems is now going to reach its final destination. and will be shared by as wide an audience as possible after overcoming the Atlantic Ocean and a number of by no means inconsiderable intellectual barriers and preconceived categories and notions that still hem in Hannah Arendt as woman cramping for freedom, her unconventional thinking, and the controversial journalist she was. Hannah Arendt's poems form an entity. As such, they have now found their legitimacy. Legitimacy, is this right? Yeah. From now on, they exist schwarz auf weiß, with a chronological appendix and some notes. I wish them good luck for their future travels, for new research into their profound connection with such major concepts as amor mundi, birth, labor, work and action, as Hannah Arendt developed them in The Human Condition and in the Denktagebuch. I will stop here. I want to save some breath for the discussion with Samantha. Questions from the audience will helpfully detail some of the specifics and variety of the poems and their translation. I predict, last sentence, surely I don't run any great risk there that we won't be able to come up with definite answers to all the questions that remain, but I trust our replies will open new doors or open old doors more widely and perhaps awaken a new and irresistible desire to read Hannah Arendt's poems.
So, Samantha, you wanna?
Can we
So-
have a look at the French?
It's
So-
French Germans.
Yes.
Yes, it's French-German. It's bilingual.
Thank you.
So it's Alsatian. So it's
so,
Alsatian.
Your
so
sensation, you're right.
C'est Alsacien. I'm going to focus more on the text of the poems and some of what I see to be some of the philosophical or political imports, or how I see poetry at work in Hannah Arendt, but also so that I have a chance to read you some of the poems in English, so that we can hear them. So, the end of 1957. I only see you, how you stood at the desk, a light falling fully over your face. The bond between our eyes was so fixed, as if it was meant to bear your weight and mine. The bond tore, and I do not know what strange fate arose between us. The one cannot see, and this look is not speaking or silent. It found a place to be heard, the voice in the poem. Reading Hannah Arendt's poetry is akin to carefully working through her papers in the archive where I first found the poems. It is the experience of entering the private space of another without their being present. It is a trespass. One might imagine standing as a spectator in the room of this poem, observing its subjects, first staring so fixedly into one another's eyes, holding all that is life becoming one, and then turning back a moment later to find it broken, and to see two individuals standing, backs turned to one another. It is an invasion into the most private part of life, but hopefully, in this instance, it is a welcome one. In many ways, Arendt is always referring back, glancing back to those thinkers, those lines of poetry, to those conversations, walking in the woods with Heidegger or with Heinrich, or evening conversations with Auden. And in this way, this referring back, Arendt makes visible the absence of the unseen, those private moments, spaces between the inner life of the mind and the act of writing, thinking, put to work. In one poem, she describes memories of the past as an imprisonment. Rising up from the still pond of the past are so many memories. Fog figures draw wistful circles of my imprisonment, elapsed, enticing at the finish. Here the past becomes a whimsical cloud, making shapes, encircling her, imprisoning her, and enticing her. It is almost playful, yet inescapable and provocative. Here it is not a looking back, but rather a rising up, a different movement which creates a gesture of emergence and condensation. The bond tore, and I do not know what strange fate arose between us. That one cannot see, and this look is not speaking or silent. It found a place to be heard, the voice in the poem. A poem provides a home for those things, experiences, memories, absences, sacred objects that would otherwise be left homeless and unremembered. Just as we can appear in the world and be heard, that which one cannot see is not speaking, can appear in the poem and be heard. How do we reckon with this absence made visible in the poem in Arendt's poetry? There are many imaginative questions to entice the reader into Arendt's poetry. Did Arendt throw away the poems she didn't like for us never to see? Did she ever admit to Auden during their weekly meetings, perhaps after a couple of glasses of wine too many, that she had also occasionally put pen to paper? I like to imagine it as a kind of confession she makes and a refusal to share, sitting in her New York apartment surrounded by all those books. And for the love of the world, Bruhl notes that not even Heinrich knew she wrote poems. And whether or not this is true, we have no way of knowing. But we do know that Hannah wrote poems for Martin, and that is inescapable. When we think of Arendt, or at least when I think of Arendt, the image of a young woman, 17, full of tender reflection, is not the first picture that comes to mind. These poems, read as a whole, offer one a different portrait, or portraits, of Arendt, because there is a difference between the early poems and the ones written during and after the war when she was in the United States. And while there is no red thread, as she might have noted, to bind them all together, there is what I call a melancholy undercurrent that runs throughout the poems. A melancholy that does not spring from a kind of depression, but rather what the Germans have a specific words for, Wehmut or Schwermut. In Schwermut, it's a sense of melancholic dejection and gloominess, whereas Wehmut signifies a melancholic form of nostalgia and plaintiveness, so that even in the pleasurable company of others, one is still conscious of the human condition, still one among others. Quote, I am only one thing among the things. This sensibility, this attunement to the world fills the reader with a sense of engagement. It is a form of contemplative inwardness that we are invited to. Melancholy, in this sense, creates an interstice between inwardness and the semblance of an external reality. In this way, it necessitates a form of plurality, even when one is alone, the two in one. In turning inwards upon oneself, a space is created not only between the self and the world, but also between the self and the subjective self that is formed by the world. This interstice, or perhaps more visually we might think of it as a doorframe, is the space between the vita contemplativa and the vita activa, between the realm of thought and the realm of action, between the public world of appearances and the private space of intimacy and thinking. Since a poem has worldly obligations for Arendt, it must appear, and yet, as she writes in The Human Condition, poetry, whose material is language, is perhaps the most human and least worldly of the arts, the one in which the end product remains closest to thought that inspired it. A poem must protect itself. Protect your core from evil intentions, she cautions. It must safeguard itself from evil, banal readings that try to corrupt its message, the message it must carry forth, our inheritance as earthly creatures, bound through language, and it must stand guard at the storehouse of memory. In Keine Kunde, we see the importance of poetry to the action of remembrance in recording suffering. Had the poet not recorded what happened, nothing would remain of the experience. And I believe you have the German in front of you. December 4th, 1952. December 14th, 1952.
Which number is this? Oh, number 12?
52.
Yeah, number 12 in the
Yeah,
number.
number 2. Well,
I'm not sure. There are different. There are 3 different versions of this poem, so I'm not sure it's the same one that Karin has. But and there is no record from those days, burning into one another, consumed with fire, harming us. The wound of luck becomes stigma, not a scar. There would be no record of those days were it not for your voice saying, allowing it to stay, the poetic word is a place, not a refuge. Were it not for the suffering seen transcribed into words, were it not for the thoughts twisted into sounds, first spoken in poetry, then thought in song, escaping from sorrow into what remains. What remains? The poem is a place that gives ear to those experiences not so easily put into words. It is the task of the poet to make tangible those earthly and worldly experiences. The poet bears the burden of truth, of recounting, of making known, and in keeping with Arendt's division of the world into private, social, and public, as flawed and fragile as those rooms might be, poetry becomes a place that can hear what would otherwise not be spoken at all. It forms thoughts into words, allowing them to appear in the world and remain in the world to be seen and heard by others. In this sense, poetry is the bridge that connects the life of thought to the life of action. It is capable of saying those silent things, of giving ear to what otherwise could not be spoken, recorded, or remembered. But poetry is also a liberating form that frees language to express the intimacy of earthliness of lived experiences. Arendt's poetry is testament to her thoughtfulness about the world and her struggle with the human condition. In her Denktagebuche in March 1955, she writes a single entry. Amor mundi. Warum ist es so schwer, die Welt zu lieben? Why is it so difficult to love the world? Followed by another entry that reads, once one has begun to think, the thoughts come like flies and suck out the lifeblood. Schwer in this context means difficult or hard, but it also takes on a sense of heaviness and severity. It creates the image in the reader's mind that to love the world is to bear a heavy burden. If we trace the root of schwer back, it means to cut, wound. It is injurious. As Arendt writes in The Human Condition, we are born into the world, but we inhabit the earth. So it is once understandable, and yet still jarring to me, that she wrote a poem that begins, I love the earth. Because we might expect to read, I love the world. But the love of the world for Arendt appears differently than the condition that facilitates our love of being on earth. November 19th, 1953. I love the earth as if traveling to a foreign place, and not otherwise. So life spins me on its thread quietly, continuously, into unknown designs, until suddenly, like the end of a journey, the great silence breaks into the frame. Here again, in Arendt's love of the earth, we are presented with an intermittent space, a break-in, the image of one traveling to earth for vacation, suitcase in hand, arriving, appearing. We are taken away on an itinerary, led down many paths, spun about, invoking the fates, until we must end our trip. It is a quietness interrupted by a silence. It is reticent and a lovely portrait of what it means to appear in the world and to be born on this planet. The space is opened up between the I as a traveler and the foreign